On the morning of April 18, 1942, the skies above Tokyo remained deceptively calm. General Hideki Tojo stood in his office at the Imperial General Headquarters, reviewing intelligence reports with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his nation's secrets were absolutely impenetrable. The Japanese military communication system, built upon the sophisticated Purple cipher machine and the intricate JN-25 naval code, represented what Japanese cryptographers considered the most advanced encryption in the world. "They will never break our code," Tojo had reportedly told his staff just weeks earlier, a sentiment echoed throughout the highest ranks of the Imperial Japanese military. What he did not know, what he could not have imagined, was that thousands of kilometers away, teams of brilliant Allied cryptographers had already been reading his most sensitive communications for months. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how a secret war of minds and mathematics changed the course of history in the Pacific, how brilliant men and women working in windowless rooms halfway around the world became the invisible architects of Allied victory, and how Japanese military confidence in their unbreakable codes became one of the greatest intelligence catastrophes in modern history. The story begins not in the tropical waters of the Pacific, but in the cramped, smoke-filled offices of a converted girls' school in Washington, D.C. There, a quiet, unassuming man named William Friedman had spent the better part of 2 decades building what would become the most formidable, code-breaking organization in American history. Friedman, born Wolf Friedman in Kishinev, Russia, had immigrated to the United States as a child and developed an almost supernatural gift for pattern recognition and cryptanalysis. By 1940, he led a team at the Signal Intelligence Service that would soon accomplish what the Japanese believed impossible. The Purple Machine, Japan's primary diplomatic cipher, was an electromechanical marvel that the Japanese Foreign Ministry had introduced in 1939. Unlike the German Enigma machine, which used rotating wheels to scramble messages, Purple employed a series of telephone stepping switches arranged in a complex configuration that created what seemed like an infinite number of possible encryption combinations. Japanese cryptographers had tested it extensively against their best codebreakers and declared it unbreakable. They were profoundly mistaken. Friedman assembled a team of 18 brilliant analysts, including Frank Rowlett, Abraham Sinkoff, and Solomon Kullback. For 18 grueling months, these men worked in absolute secrecy, often sleeping on cots beside their desks, surviving on coffee and determination. They had no captured machine to study, no blueprints to reference, nothing but intercepted messages and their own extraordinary minds. What they accomplished was nothing short of miraculous. "We were working blind," Rowlett would later recall. "We had to imagine the machine that could produce these patterns, reverse engineer something we had never seen. It was like trying to rebuild a clock by listening to its ticking from the next room." The breakthrough came in September 1940, when the team finally constructed a working replica of the Purple Machine entirely from first principles. They had built an exact functional duplicate of a device they had never seen, based purely on mathematical analysis of its output. Friedman called their creation magic, and the intelligence it would produce over the coming years would justify that name many times over. But Purple was only part of the puzzle. The Japanese Navy used an entirely different system for operational communications, a codebook-based cipher known as JN-25. This code would prove even more critical to the outcome of the Pacific conflict, and breaking it would require an entirely different approach. In Melbourne, Australia, a young American naval officer named Joseph Rochefort had established what he called the Dungeon, a basement intelligence center officially designated as Station Hypo. Rochefort was an eccentric genius who often worked in his bathrobe and slippers, chain-smoking and surviving on sandwiches brought by devoted staff members. His team of analysts, many of them recruited from the Navy's musician and language programs, worked around the clock in conditions that would have broken lesser individuals. "The pressure was unimaginable," remembered one analyst who served under Rochefort. "We knew that every day we failed to break a message, someone might be sailing into an ambush. Every hour mattered. Every minute counted. The weight of responsibility pressed down on all of us constantly. The JN25 code was fiendishly complex. Unlike Purple's machine encryption, it relied on a codebook containing approximately 33,000 five-digit groups, each representing a word, phrase, or concept. These groups were then super-enciphered using additive tables, essentially adding random numbers to each code group to create the final encrypted message. Breaking it required not only identifying the underlying code groups, but also stripping away the additive encryption, a process that demanded vast amounts of intercepted traffic and painstaking analysis. By early 1942, Rochefort's team had made significant progress. They could read perhaps 15 to 20% of intercepted Japanese naval messages, enough to piece together fragments of enemy intentions, but not enough to provide complete operational intelligence. What they needed was more traffic, more examples of the same additive tables being reused, more opportunities to identify patterns. The conflict in the Pacific was about to provide exactly that. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, a young cryptanalyst named Rudolph Fabian worked feverishly at Station Cast on the island of Corregidor. As Japanese forces closed in on the beleaguered American garrison, Fabian and his team continued breaking codes, even as artillery shells fell around them. In one of the most remarkable acts of the intelligence campaign, they eliminated their equipment and burned their records only hours before Japanese forces overran their position, ensuring that the enemy would never learn how much of their communications had been compromised. The information flowing from these code-breaking operations reached the highest levels of Allied command. President Franklin Roosevelt received daily briefings on magic intercepts, reading Japanese diplomatic communications almost as quickly as the intended recipients in Tokyo. But the true value of signals intelligence would be demonstrated not in diplomatic maneuvering, but in the strategic calculus of naval operations. In the spring of 1942, intercepted messages began revealing Japanese intentions for a major offensive. Rochefort's team at Station Hypo worked with unprecedented intensity, piecing together fragments of decoded traffic like a massive jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. The picture that emerged was alarming. The Japanese combined fleet was planning a massive operation, the largest naval offensive since the conflict began. But where would they strike? The decoded messages referred repeatedly to a target designated only as AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand northwest of Hawaii that served as a crucial American forward base. But his superiors in Washington disagreed, arguing that AF could just as easily refer to the Aleutian Islands or even Hawaii itself. The debate threatened to paralyze American defensive preparations. Rochefort proposed an audacious solution. He ordered the garrison at Midway to transmit an uncoded message reporting that the island's freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Within days, his team intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was experiencing water difficulties. The identity of the target was confirmed beyond any doubt. Armed with this intelligence, Admiral Chester Nimitz made one of the most consequential decisions of the Pacific conflict. He positioned his three available aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, in an ambush position northeast of Midway. The Japanese, utterly confident in the security of their communications, believed they were achieving complete strategic surprise. They had no idea they were sailing into a trap. The encounter that followed in early June 1942 became a turning point. Thanks to the intelligence advantage provided by the codebreakers, American forces were able to position themselves optimally and act at the most vulnerable moment. The outcome fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the Pacific, turning the tide of the entire conflict in ways that would only become fully apparent in the months and years that followed. But the code-breaking effort was far from over. In fact, the intelligence services faced an ongoing challenge that would persist throughout the conflict. The Japanese periodically changed their codes and additive tables, sometimes requiring weeks or months of effort to break back in. Every change meant a temporary blindness, a period when American commanders had to operate without their invisible advantage. In Australia, a remarkable facility known as the Central Bureau had been established under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. There, American and Australian cryptanalysts worked side by side, focused primarily on Japanese army codes. The Japanese military used a bewildering variety of cipher systems, from simple substitution codes used by frontline units to sophisticated machine ciphers employed for high-level communications. One of the most significant figures at Central Bureau was a young Australian linguist named Eric Nave. Nave had spent years studying Japanese naval communications before the conflict and possessed an almost intuitive understanding of Japanese military terminology and thinking. His insights helped American analysts understand not just what the Japanese were saying, but what they meant, interpreting the subtle nuances of military language that could mean the difference between accurate intelligence and dangerous misunderstanding. The Japanese military mind was different from ours, Nave explained in later years. They used indirection, implication, context. A message that seemed routine might contain vital intelligence hidden in the choice of a single word. Breaking the code was only the first step. Understanding the message was equally important and often far more challenging. The human element of the code-breaking enterprise extended far beyond the analysts themselves. Thousands of radio operators, scattered across the Pacific in remote listening posts, intercepted the raw traffic that fed the intelligence machine. These young men, many barely out of their teens, sat for endless hours wearing headphones, transcribing the dots and dashes of Japanese Morse code. Their work was tedious, exhausting, and absolutely essential to the entire operation. One such operator was a 19-year-old named Kenneth Morton, stationed at a lonely outpost in the Australian outback. "We worked in shifts around the clock," Morton remembered. The static was terrible, and the Japanese operators were fast and remarkably proficient. You had to maintain complete concentration for hours at a time. One missed character could make an entire message unreadable. The isolation was profound, but we knew our work mattered. The intercepted messages traveled through a complex chain of processing before reaching operational commanders. First, they were transmitted to central collection points, where analysts sorted them by frequency, call sign, and apparent importance. Priority traffic was then forwarded to the code-breaking centers, where cryptanalysts applied their expertise to decrypt and translate the contents. Finally, the intelligence was summarized, evaluated, and distributed to those with a need to know, all under the strictest security protocols imaginable. The security surrounding the code-breaking operation was perhaps the most closely guarded aspect of the entire Allied effort. Allied commanders understood that if the Japanese ever suspected their codes were compromised, they would immediately change their entire encryption system, potentially ending the intelligence advantage that had proven so valuable. This meant that some of the most critical secrets had to be protected not just from the enemy, but from the vast majority of Allied personnel as well. Only a handful of senior officers were cleared to receive the raw intelligence product. When code-breaking information was used to plan operations, elaborate cover stories were created to explain how the intelligence had been obtained. Reconnaissance flights were dispatched to discover enemy positions already known from intercepts. Agents were credited with providing information actually derived from decoded messages. The deception was constant and comprehensive, requiring extraordinary coordination. This security imperative created agonizing dilemmas for those in command. On several occasions, Allied commanders possessed advance warning of Japanese operations, but could not act on the intelligence without revealing its source. Ships sometimes sailed into danger because protecting them would have compromised the code-breaking secret. Difficult decisions were made to preserve an advantage that would benefit many more in the long run. These were the terrible calculations of secret intelligence, weighing immediate costs against future benefits. The Japanese, meanwhile, remained remarkably oblivious to the compromise of their communications. Their confidence in their codes bordered on the mystical. When operations went wrong, when ambushes failed, when reinforcement convoys were intercepted, Japanese commanders attributed their misfortunes to bad luck, poor security among subordinate units, or American espionage on the ground. The possibility that their fundamental communication system had been penetrated seems never to have been seriously considered at the highest levels. This blindness was reinforced by the Japanese military culture itself. To suggest that the codes might be compromised was to imply failure on the part of those responsible for communications security, an accusation that could ruin careers and disgrace families. Junior officers who raised concerns were dismissed or silenced. The institutional incentives all pointed toward continued faith in the system, regardless of accumulating evidence to the contrary. They simply could not conceive that we had broken their codes, explained one post-war intelligence analyst. It was not just arrogance, though there was certainly that. It was a failure of imagination. They had tested their systems against their own cryptographers and found them secure. The idea that foreign minds could succeed where Japanese expertise had failed was literally unthinkable to them. As the conflict progressed, the intelligence advantage provided by code breaking became ever more decisive. American submarines, armed with decoded information about Japanese convoy routes and schedules, disrupted the maritime supply lines that sustained the Japanese industrial effort. Aircraft carriers were positioned to intercept enemy task forces before they could threaten Allied operations. Ground commanders knew when and where enemy reinforcements would arrive, allowing them to prepare accordingly. The submarine campaign in particular benefited enormously from signals intelligence. By 1943, American submarines equipped with decoded routing information were achieving remarkable results against Japanese merchant shipping. Captain Dudley Morton of the submarine Wahoo became famous for his aggressive patrols, but his achievements were built in part on intelligence provided by the codebreakers. He knew where to find his targets, transforming what might have been weeks of fruitless searching into efficient and effective operations. The same intelligence that enabled offensive operations also provided crucial early warning of Japanese defensive preparations. When American forces planned landings, decoded messages often revealed the strength and disposition of enemy garrisons, the arrival of reinforcements, and the intentions of local commanders. This foreknowledge benefited countless personnel by allowing operations to be modified or rescheduled when circumstances warranted, and it gave commanders confidence in their planning. Yet the code-breaking enterprise was never a simple or certain source of intelligence. The Japanese used dozens of different codes and ciphers, some of which were never fully broken despite years of effort. Messages were sometimes intercepted, but not decrypted in time to be useful. Translation errors introduced uncertainty, and the enemy's intentions, even when clearly stated in decoded messages, could change without warning, rendering carefully planned responses obsolete. The analysts who labored in the code-breaking centers understood these limitations better than anyone. "We never forgot that we were dealing with fragments," one veteran remembered. A message here, a traffic analysis there, a decoded weather report that revealed the location of a fleet. We pieced together mosaics from broken tiles, and sometimes the picture was clear, and sometimes it was not. Humility was essential. The pressure took its toll on even the strongest minds. William Friedman, the genius behind the breaking of purple, suffered a complete nervous breakdown in January 1941 and was hospitalized for months. The strain of the work, combined with his perfectionist nature and the impossibility of sharing his burdens, proved overwhelming. Joseph Rochefort, whose work on JN-25 had been instrumental in the Midway triumph, was removed from his command after political conflicts with Washington and spent the rest of the conflict in obscurity. The intensity of the work, combined with the impossibility of sharing their achievements or receiving public recognition, broke some of the finest minds engaged in the effort. For those who persevered, the rewards were intangible but profound. They knew, even if they could never say, that their work had changed the course of history. Every operation made possible by their intelligence, every life preserved by advance warning, every strategic advantage gained through decoded communications was their legacy, a legacy they would carry in silence for decades. As 1943 turned to 1944, the tide of conflict had turned decisively. Japanese forces were in retreat across the Pacific, their once mighty fleet reduced to a shadow of its former strength. The intelligence advantage that had helped make this possible continued to pay dividends, but the nature of the code-breaking effort was changing as well. The Japanese, finally recognizing that something was wrong with their communication security, began implementing more frequent code changes and additional security measures. These changes slowed but did not stop the Allied intelligence effort. By this point, the code-breaking organizations had grown enormously, with thousands of personnel and substantial resources devoted to the task. When old codes were compromised and new ones introduced, the machinery to break them was already in place and ready to adapt. One of the most remarkable aspects of the code-breaking effort was the extent to which it remained secret, even after the conflict ended. The full story of Allied signals intelligence was not officially acknowledged until the 1970s, 3 decades after the events themselves. Veterans who had served in the code-breaking centers kept their silence, honoring security oaths that had never been lifted. Many went to their final rest without ever telling their families what they had done, carrying secrets that had shaped history. The story of the Allied code-breaking effort is ultimately a story of minds in conflict. It demonstrates that such struggles are won not just with material resources and physical courage, but with intelligence in every sense of that word. The Japanese generals who laughed at the notion that their codes could be broken were not foolish or incompetent. They were simply wrong, victims of an institutional certainty that blinded them to their own vulnerability. The legacy of this secret effort extended far beyond the Pacific. The techniques and organizations developed during the conflict became the foundation for modern signals intelligence. The National Security Agency, the largest intelligence organization in the world, traces its lineage directly to the codebreakers of that era. The fundamental tension between secure communication and the desire to intercept enemy messages continues to shape international relations and national security to this day, in ways both visible and hidden. Perhaps the most profound lesson of the code-breaking campaign is the danger of unexamined assumptions. The Japanese military assumed their codes were secure because they had been designed by Japanese experts and tested by Japanese cryptographers. They never considered that a different approach, a different perspective, might reveal vulnerabilities invisible to them. This failure of imagination proved catastrophic, a lesson that resonates far beyond the realm of cryptography. In the months before Japan's surrender, the codebreakers continued their work with undiminished intensity. They read messages documenting the desperate state of the Japanese home islands, the shortages of food and fuel, the declining morale of military and civilian populations alike. They followed the internal debates within the Japanese government about whether and how to end the conflict. They watched, through the unique lens of decoded communications, as history reached its conclusion, witnessing the end of an era from their windowless rooms. When the end finally came in August 1945, the codebreakers knew before almost anyone else. They had read the Japanese diplomatic traffic proposing surrender, followed the negotiations conducted through neutral intermediaries, monitored the agonized discussions within the Japanese government. For them, the announcement of peace was the culmination of months of decoded anxiety and hope, a moment both triumphant and bittersweet. The men and women who had broken the Japanese codes dispersed into civilian life, bound by their security oaths to remain silent. William Friedman continued his work in government cryptography, though his health never fully recovered from the strain of those years. Joseph Rochefort, denied the recognition he deserved during the conflict, was finally awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in 1986, 10 years after his passing. The radio operators and analysts, the translators and traffic analysts, returned to ordinary lives carrying extraordinary secrets that would define them forever. Their story reminds us that such conflicts involve far more than weapons and warriors. Behind every operation, every tactical decision, every strategic plan, lies a vast architecture of intelligence and analysis. The men who broke the Japanese codes did not fire weapons or pilot aircraft, but their contribution to the Allied cause was as significant as any displayed in the field. They were warriors of the mind, fighting battles that no one could see. General Tojo's confident assertion that the Allied forces would never break Japanese codes became one of history's great ironies. The codes had already been broken when he spoke those words, and they would remain compromised throughout the conflict. His certainty, shared by virtually the entire Japanese military establishment, was a house built on sand. When it collapsed, It took with it any remaining hope of Japanese victory, revealing the hollow foundation of misplaced confidence. The codebreakers themselves rarely spoke of their work in terms of heroism or glory. They were technicians, solving puzzles of surpassing difficulty under impossible pressure. But in their quiet way, they helped shape the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. They proved that the mind could be as decisive a tool as any ever forged, and that the secrets men try hardest to keep are often the first to be revealed to those with patience and brilliance. Today, the descendants of those wartime code-breaking organizations continue their work in an age of quantum computers and artificial intelligence. The methods have changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. Somewhere, someone is trying to communicate secretly. Somewhere else, someone is trying to listen. The effort continues, invisible and endless, a legacy of the brilliant minds who prove that no secret is truly safe from determined and creative intelligence. The next time you send an encrypted message, make a secure online transaction, or simply browse the internet with any expectation of privacy, remember that you are participating in a tradition that stretches back to those smoke-filled rooms where William Friedman and his colleagues first broke the unbreakable. The mathematical principles they discovered, the organizational structures they created, the very concept of signals intelligence as we understand it today, all trace their origins to that desperate effort to read the enemy's communications. And remember, too, the Japanese general who laughed at the very idea that his codes could be broken. His laughter echoes still across the decades, a reminder of the danger of certainty in an uncertain world, and of the remarkable human capacity to achieve what others declare impossible. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.